The order came at 2 a.m. Eastern. Valves along the bridge main line to U.S. slammed shut, cutting off nearly 500,000 barrels a day headed for Trump's refineries. In Sarnia, tank levels stopped climbing. In the Gulf Coast, traders waked to crude prices dipping before sunrise. And in Alberta's dispatch room, a new map glows on the wall, one that doesn't end in Houston or Chicago, but at a deep water port on James Bay with tankers bound for Europe. Canada hasn't just slowed the flow, it's redrawn the oil map overnight. It's not a sudden rupture, but a prelude. Ontario, Alberta, and Saskatchewan have joined forces on a feasibility study for a new energy corridor that would run from Alberta's oil sands straight to Ontario's refining hub, bypassing the southbound dependency that's defined Canada's energy exports for decades. The proposed route ends not in the U.S. Midwest or Gulf Coast, but at deep water ports on James Bay, Hudson Bay, and the Great Lakes, gateways to Atlantic markets. For the U.S., this is the first sign that its largest crude supplier is testing the idea of turning away. Canada's oil map has always been tilted south. In 2024, the country exported over 4 million barrels per day of crude, and nearly every drop went to the United States. Ontario, too far from Western supply to feed its own refineries directly, imported close to 500,000 barrels per day, most of it from the U.S. That meant Canadian crude often traveled into the States only to be refined or redistributed back across the border at U.S. terms. This corridor changes the equation. Instead of relying on U.S. infrastructure to reach Ontario, Western Canadian oil could move east entirely within Canadian borders, cutting out the middle link. The logic is cold and transactional. Feed Ontario's refineries directly, reduce exposure to U.S. bottlenecks, and open new maritime routes for export. But beneath that logic lies a much sharper edge. U.S. refiners have built their operations around the consistent discount on Western Canadian heavy crude, a margin created by Canada's limited access to global markets. Add new eastbound capacity and new tidewater access, and that discount begins to narrow. The same barrels that U.S. refiners have relied on to keep margins fat would start competing at global prices. This isn't a vague possibility. It's built into the geography. Ontario's Sarnia Complex, home to Imperial's 120,000 barrel per day refinery and Suncor's 85,000 barrel per day plant, sits just miles from Great Lakes shipping routes. If Western crude reaches those refineries without detouring through U.S. lines, the same infrastructure that moves refined products could send surplus volumes eastward to tidewater. In a single step, Canada could lower domestic transport costs, increase security of supply for its industrial heartland, and carve a path to overseas buyers. The public framing is defensive. Ontario's Infrastructure Minister King Surma warns of unprecedented tariffs from the United States and a world growing more unstable. Premier Doug Ford says bluntly that the days of relying entirely on the U.S. are well gone. Yet, the mechanics of the plan reveal something more ambitious. By building a route that delivers oil and gas east, Canada isn't just shielding itself from disruption. It's positioning to sell to any market that can pay. That's where the U.S. dilemma, really sharpens. In 2024, Canadian crude covered 60% of all U.S. crude imports and nearly a quarter of total U.S. refinery throughput. Much of that flow is heavy crude, which U.S. refineries in the Midwest and Gulf are specifically configured to process. If even a fraction of those barrels are diverted east, U.S. buyers must look elsewhere, most likely to Latin America or the Middle East at prices closer to Brent. Margins shrink, and the quiet advantage American refiners have held for years ere this. The provinces aren't hiding their intentions. The study includes port developments, new refinery possibilities, and even links to all-season roads and broadband for remote northern communities. It's as much an industrial strategy as an energy plan. The proposed corridor could also connect to Ontario's Ring of Fire region, which is rich in critical minerals needed for electric vehicles and batteries. Energy in, minerals out, a two-way artery designed for the next 50 years of trade. For Ottawa, it's a rare moment of provincial unity. Alberta sees a way to sell its crude at higher netbacks. Ontario secures feedstock for its refineries without crossing a border. Saskatchewan gains infrastructure that moves both oil and agricultural products east. Each province gets a piece of the strategic insulation, and every step moves Canada further from its long-standing role as a price taker in United States energy markets. Then comes the operational wild card. Ontario's Chemical Valley currently depends on NB Bridges Line 5 and mainline systems, United States-linked pipelines moving crude and natural gas liquids from the west. Line 5 alone can carry up to 540,000 barrels per day. If that line were disrupted by politics, legal battles, or technical failures, Ontario's refineries and petrochemical plants would face immediate supply strain. A parallel domestic route would break that dependence overnight. This is where the plan flips its own narrative. Sold as a shield against foreign tariffs, it doubles as a sword, able to redirect supply in ways that alter the continental balance. The United States would still import millions of Canadian barrels, but not by default. Every barrel will be part of a choice, not an obligation. Let's stop here because, the easy read is to treat this as a pipeline story, but it really isn't. This is actually a redrawing of the North American energy map, where, geography becomes negotiable. The most striking element isn't the steel in the ground, but honestly, the ports on the horizon. James Bay and Hudson Bay are icebound for part of the year, but advances in ice-glass shipping and port infrastructure could, make them viable export points for much longer seasons. From there, Canadian crude could move to Europe, bypassing choke points like the Panama Canal entirely. Great Lakes ports could connect to Atlantic routes via the St. Lawrence Seaway, giving Ontario direct access to maritime markets without touching U.S. customs. If that happens, U.S. influence over Canadian export flows diminishes in a way not seen since the original West Rail links were built. The market signal would be immediate. Canadian heavy crude would price closer to global benchmarks, reducing the long-standing spread against West Texas Intermediate. For Canadian producers, that means higher revenues. For U.S. refiners, higher input costs. There's another layer of irony. For years, United States energy policy has encouraged Canada to build more export capacity on the assumption that most of it would still flow south. But by pursuing its own east-west corridor, Canada is actually using that encouragement to create options that compete with United States buyers. The very logic that once served American energy security is now being repurposed to limit its leverage. This corridor isn't being sold to the public as a geopolitical maneuver, but the implications are honestly unavoidable. A country that sends nearly all its crude to one market is vulnerable to that market's policy shifts. A country with multiple routes and multiple buyers can turn those routes into bargaining chips. So the announcement may be framed in the language of domestic resilience, but it's also a message to Washington. Canadian oil will go where it gets the best terms. On the ground, the project would be vast. New pipelines across multiple provinces, port facilities built for ice-glass tankers, possibly a new refinery along the route. Each step requiring capital, regulatory clearance, and in many cases, indigenous consultation agreements. The feasibility study will map not just engineering challenges, but the financing structure to de-risk investments, a detail Premier Ford has already called critical. While all of this is framed as a study, the political tone suggests momentum. Ontario's leadership has been the era of 100% reliance on U.S. infrastructure is over. Alberta's government sees any path to higher realized prices as a win. Saskatchewan views east-west links as long overdue. In this alleged explicit famine of interests, the corridor becomes more than a contingency. It becomes a goal. The U.S. still has leverage. Its refinery network, storage capacity, and purchasing power make it a natural buyer for Canadian crude. But the stability of that role is now conditional. In a world where Canadian oil can reach Europe or other Atlantic markets without passing through U.S. territory, Washington's bargaining position changes. The end game is as much about perception as it is about barrels. A Canada that can move oil east at will is a Canada that can sit at the negotiating table with options in hand. The corridor might never carry enough crude to replace U.S. volumes, but it doesn't have to. It only has to exist to change the conversation. And that's the real shift. This isn't just a pipeline. It's a signal that the age of single market dependence is ending. The United States may still be Canada's biggest customer, but it will no longer be its only one by design. In the quiet hiss of those idle pipelines lies a message,